Okay, welcome back. Let's pick up where I left off in the first half of this lecture. I just went off and had a quick coffee, so hope you guys did too, but if not, you can pause and get that now. So in this bit, we're going to look at the basics of working in 3D or 3D modeling as a platform, and not just on 3ds Max, but a lot of these terminologies or a lot of these phrases, terms that you learn in this apply through most 3D software in the industry. There are slight differences, and they vary slightly between, one package will use a certain term for one thing and another package will use a certain color for another thing. But generally, if you get these ideas and, you understand these ideas, you can look at most 3D software and understand where everything is and how to utilize it. So 2D versus 3D. So when we design something in 2D, we generally place our measurements on what are commonly termed as the X and Y axis. Obviously, 2D is a flat shape, and the X and Y will go along and across, with generally the X representing the width and Y representing the height. A lot of you would have come across this with things like graphs and all that, but it's utilized in lots of different terms, especially in maths. But when we add 3D to it, we add a third dimension, and that will be the Z-axis. And the Z-axis gives us depth to the actual object. So in 3ds Max, the red arrow on here, I don't know if that's capturing my cursor. Yes, it is. The red arrow on here is the X. The green arrow is the Y, and the blue arrow is the Z. So as you can see, we can actually create 3D objects using those three axes. And this is actually flipped the wrong way for 3ds Max, but I won't go into that because the Y-axis is actually the up and down. The X-axis is the going along this way, and the Z-axis is actually the depth going backwards away from, say, the camera or away from the position. So like my camera is in a Z-axis from me. Anyway, I said I wouldn't go on to it. I did go on to it. Anyway, there we go. So if we were to plot 4 points along an X and Y in 2D and then connect those 4 points up, they would be the corners of a square block or a rectangle block. And you've got to think of 3D software or the 3ds Max as being a graphical interface for the mathematical calculations that are going on behind it. You don't need to know exactly what's going on behind it with the mathematical calculations, but the 3ds Max or most 3D software is a graphical interface for us to access and to be able to visually see what it's calculating in the background and actually have a visuals. So slightly off, not topic, but off on a tangent. So back in the early days of early computer graphics, there was no graphical interface. A lot of these things were actually programmed in using the maths and figures. And I'm pretty sure when it was when they were first making Toy Story, the first Toy Story, the software that they used, it's called RenderMan, or the computer they used was called actual Pixar computer, but the rendering software was called RenderMan. And to animate things, they actually had to enter a load of numbers in. So but if I just stick to the X, Y, and Z. So for each thing that moved in a scene, they actually had to enter in the actual movement on the X, Y, and Z of the actual where that was in a 3D world that they weren't actually seeing. So they would have to go off to one piece of software and tell that piece of software to give all the coordinates of this object in that world, then take that and put that into another piece of software which would then actually move that object in the 3D world. And you can imagine how many objects and how many things are moving and all that to create those animations. But we're lucky now. Software and hardware's got a lot quicker and better. So if we had to plot if we added the extra, so we've done the 2D with the 4 squares. That's me going off at the tangent, of course. But that's if we have the 4 positions to make a square. If we add an extra layer as the Z axis, then we can add 3D to add another 4 points. So the bottom of the cube would be another 4 points. And then if we filled all that in, we would actually get a cube. So that's kind of how the 3D software works, is it looks at where all the points are and then tries to calculate the connections between them. So in 3D, these axes are typically represented by their own colors. In 3ds Max, as say, different software have their own versions of this and it's slightly different, but generally, or especially for 3ds Max, which we are learning, red is the X axis, green is the Y, and blue is the Z. But not to get too worried about that, you don't have to memorize that. 3ds Max has a nice little icon thing, or a nice little gizmo, they're called, on screen that shows you the axes and the colors as well. So, but it helps us determine which axis we're looking at and how we, can use those axes to manipulate when we're changing things. So if we look at manipulators, these help us transform our 3D objects in the following ways. So we have translate, which actually moves an object, can be in any of the axes. So X, Y, or Z is the translate. Rotation obviously rotates an object in lots of different axes. And that can be from a central point of the object or from an actual, from a different point of the object. So you can actually move things around a central thing and rotate things around. And scale increases or decreases the size of the object. And that doesn't have to be uniform. That could be squash and stretching things in different uniform ways, or you can do it as making things smaller and larger. So we've got move, and that is the gizmo, and that is the technical term for it. It is called a gizmo. And that is the move gizmo, and it gives you these arrows. Hard to see on here, but these arrows are actually like a 3D cone shape, which obviously points into the direction that it will move. And they do move in the opposite direction, even though that arrow is up and down. They do move in the opposite direction, and moving backwards and forwards. So if you grabbed the end of this arrow, or it's hard to grab these little lines, but if you actually clicked on the end of the arrow, then you would be able to pull that object in that direction. Rotation usually looks like this gizmo, and this is called a gimbal. And this gizmo helps you rotate. So round the outside with the white circle basically is a free-for-all rotation. So you could grab it and drag around in any of the axes. But if you only wanted to rotate on the X, you'd grab the red line here and drag, and the cube would rotate in the X. And obviously the center point there is the point of where it will rotate from. Same on all these transforms here. That point in the middle is the point of where it will transform from. So this cube will actually rotate around the center of that, the center point there. Scale is usually indicated by these 3D cubes at the end. So the arrows change to a cube, and grabbing that will, so if I grab the blue one there, then it would actually pull the transform of the cube up, or the scale of the cube up, elongating it to be taller in this respect. And same again, that will scale from the center point. So it won't just scale, it won't just pull up from the bottom there. It will actually extend at the top, and the bottom will extend out. And that's a combination of all, where you have a manipulator where you can grab anything and move it in any way. And that can get quite confusing in actually precisely moving objects and grabbing the right thing and it doing what you want. But there is an option available there. So primitives, or geometric primitives. We commonly use geometric primitives as the basis for our 3D models. From there on, we can shape these objects by manipulating the individual components of the polygons that they are made of to obtain a desired result. So when I'm talking about primitives, and these obviously are the objects, or the shapes that you can create, it's easier to create something from these objects that are already made, or these primitives that are already made, and then either combining them or manipulating them or transforming them to suit something that that you're trying to create. And this is, so you can build up an object itself. You can plot, they're called splines, but you can plot splines onto the graph and build objects that way, and get the software to build up that way. And there is a form of modeling that using that utilizes that. But the simplest way is to do it this way, where you have things like a cone, a sphere. A cone is like a triangle, but obviously with a circle, a round bottom, and it comes to a peak. A sphere is the ball. Your cubes, which can be, not, it doesn't have to be an actual square cube. Just you have cylinders, planes, and a torus, which is a donut shape. But most 3D software has access to all or some of these, and generally a couple more. And anybody who's already watched my video at getting started in 3ds Max, or the user interface of 3ds Max, will see there are a few more to that. So here's a few examples of a cube, highlighted in the back in blue, a cone, a cylinder, and a sphere. I've not put sphere on the list here. Oh yeah, and a sphere. And they're all represented in the 3D space. So as you see, you might be able to see this 3D grid works as a platform in the middle of your workspace, and it tells you there also that's the X plane there, and it'll have a Y up here as well. So that'll be Z here, and then it doesn't show up and down, but you can see this cone is directly at the middle of the grid, which will be the world position of 0, 0, 0. So you think about your world position in X, Y, and Z. 0, 0, 0 is dead center of the world. That's where that'll be. The cube is placed probably, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're probably about 4 or 5 offset there, and the cylinder is in front, and the sphere is below the actual world plane. this this plane here, this grid plane is you can switch it on and off, but it's only visible to yourself. If you render things out, it doesn't show there, but it's quite a nice grid to access and see in your viewport. So polygons, what are polygons? Polygons are the most common used geometry that makes up the shapes of a 3D model. And they're typically 3-sided or tris or 4-sided quads. And as you can see in these two examples here, so the polygon is the triangle bits in the middle, all that make up the whole shape. So it's basically taken the surface of the sphere and divided it into these triangles, these tris. Or with this cube, it's divided it into quads or 4 sides or 4 shapes, 4 points. And most or all software, all 3D software uses either one of these or both of these, and you do have access to convert one to the other and do it the other way around. Another little tangent: game engines prefer tris for their modeling or for their calculations. So when game engines run, they prefer to have things models as a tri. Animation and VFX and film work and high quality stuff prefers things as quads. And it says here, quads are preferable when creating 3D models as they help to ensure that models will deform properly if required during animation. And they're also a bit easier or a bit less calculation heavy for texturing. But generally in game engine things, objects aren't deformed in real time. So objects are placed in the world and they work, or they are moved within the world in the 3D world as they actually are. It's very few games that, unless it's a cutscene or something like that, but it's very few games that will actually deform things in real time. So that's probably, I think this is the less performance intensive, but also the less, it gives you the least options. So we'll be working with polygons in quads. And the components of a polygon. So a polygon is made up of a few different components, and next couple of slides we go over those. So first off, we've got vertices and a vertex. An individual vertices is a predefined point found in 3D space. And same again, this goes back to the maths, and anybody who's done a bit of maybe higher maths or even above higher maths might have come across vertices and vertexes in that. But this is, the calculation of a point within a 3D space, within a 3D volume in a 3D world. And connecting 3 or 4 vertices will create a face. So on this sphere, each corner of this this sort of square here, or any of these squares, where the 4 corners meet, will be a vertex on all of these. So you can imagine there's a couple of thousand vertexes or vertices on this actual sphere that's made up. The more of these faces that you have, the more of these squares that you have, the smoother the object will look. But the longer it takes to calculate and render and work out all those positions of all those. And generally when we manipulate things, so if we wanted to make this sphere into a different shape, we would grab one of these vertexes, and we could, when we grab it, I moved to the next slide. When we grab it, that little gizmo will appear with the 3 arrows, and we can translate it or move it in lots of different directions, and then that will then stretch the faces that are attached to it into different shapes. So that's how we would get different shapes. Edges are the positions between two vertexes. So it's the long line, and you can grab those and you can move those. So instead of having to grab two vertexes and move them separately, sometimes it's better to grab an edge and move that, push that, pull that, scale it, whatever you need to do, just to translate it in a different way. And faces are, as I kind of already said, are the bits that are in between the four or the either 3 or 4 vertices, and they're the things that are visible, makes the visible surface of the model, and it's also what we apply the textures to, or the materials to make the object look like what it does. And as it says there, they are basically the fill between the edges and the vertices of a polygon. And the more faces you have, the higher resolution the actual object will be. So how do we manipulate these components? There are some commonly used methods to help us sculpt our models into the shapes that we require. And as I kind of said, you can grab the vertices, the faces, or the edges, and you can actually move them around. You can scale them or you can rotate them. But beside that, there are a few other tools that we can use. So we have extrude, subdivision, loop cut and slide, and bevels. And we'll go into those in the next couple of slides there. Get my PowerPoint work. There we go. Okay, so extrude allows us to pull out and create additional geometry from an existing model. And it can be applied to faces, edges, or vertices. Easiest way to think about it is on this cube, I've grabbed this face. You can see it slightly different colorized there. So I've grabbed this face and I've actually pulled it out along this path here. So that'll be along the Z path. And I've pulled it out this way, and it's extruded the cube to have this additional geometry, these additional polygons along this edges here. And you can extrude along and pull it along. You can grab any of these faces and you could pull that one up there, and then it would cause it to have an additional 3D shape there. Doesn't only have to be 3D. If it's already a 3D, if it's attached to things, it will pull them along and extrude those along as well. Or you could do it even if you grab the vertices or the lines. But the easiest way to do it is, and probably the best way to think about it, is grabbing a face and pulling it out to build up additional material, additional objects, geometry behind it. You can also extrude, but inwards. So if I wanted to make this cube hollow in the inside, I would grab this face and I could push it inward. If I pushed it inward, it would probably cause issues because there's already a face here and I'm trying to push inward on a face. So the best way to do it would be to create a slight extrude on the inside of it, and then imagine that in the middle of that cube, then there would be another face in the middle of that cube, and then push that face in, so you'd get a little edge to it, and then you'd be pushing it down. So even though it's the opposite to extruding, would that be intruding, I guess? But you would be going inwards. It's still classed as an extrude. It did work this time. Subdivisions can be used to add additional faces to a full object, or split an object, split an individual face up further. In doing so, this increases the number of vertices and edges available for manipulation. And this is good for smoothing of an object, but it also can be undesirable as it makes the mesh more complex. More complex a mesh, as I said, the more faces, the more vertices, the more edges, all that you have on something, the longer it takes for the software to calculate that. So generally, we try to keep things as low poly as possible, and that's going back to the game and the film animation example or the visualization example. Games try to keep things as low poly counts, as low the meshes as simple as possible, so it can run faster because it has to do everything in real time. Where with visualization and in animation and films and things, we can keep things very high or quite high and basically send it off for a computer to spend a long time on calculating it all and working it out and getting the best possible results. But subdivision basically here has divided this front edge into lots of smaller faces, and then you'll be able to then manipulate each of these faces or these vertices further to make a more complex shape. Loop, cut, and slide is it's a tool. So instead of having to subdivide every face on this cube, if we just wanted to have this cube split into two, not actually as two separate parts, but have all the faces along this cube split into two. So each side of this cube would have two faces. Then we could use the subdivide and the loop cut and not the subdivide. We could use the loop cut tool to create a cut in the faces along where this pink is going. So this pink is actually going around the back and along each side. And once you select this, you have the chance to slide it up and down, move it around. So you could have it a bit closer to the top and have one face there and then a large face here, or as it's positioned here, it's dead in the middle. So it would cut it. So you'd have a face at the top, face at the bottom on each of these sides. Obviously it wouldn't do the top and the bottoms, but they would be along all the sides. And yeah, it can help things like where you don't want to subdivide it so it creates 10 more faces within something, but just creating 3 or 4 faces or 3 or 4 subdivisions on that face would make it look a lot smoother. Obviously on this cube's not a great example of that, but you could do it where you could make it having those minimum amount of faces to make it look as smooth as possible would help. But also it helps when you're trying to create a mesh or create geometry that you can then extrude from and things to make something a bit more complex. Bevel has its own tool where bevel creates a chamfer or a rounded corner or a rounded edge onto something. This example, obviously, it's just created one bevel and it's not very rounded. So you could create a point sort of mesh like this. But imagine this had another 5 bevels in between it, and each one was slightly curved in a way or positioned in a way that it would give a lot neater of a curve along here. So then that would cause a nice bevel. And as it says there, it's good for realism, and that what we're trying to create in our visualization is we're trying to create realism, make something look an object look as real as possible or close to what the real object will look as possible. And in the real world, there's practically nothing has a very clean, sharp edge. Obviously, it might look sharp to our eyes, but if you zoomed in on had a microscope or even a magnifying glass, you can see almost everything has a little roundness to the edge. Now, it all comes down to personal preference, and obviously you're going to have to weigh up whether creating a chamfer on an edge of something actually offers the benefits against the downsides of it creating more faces, more geometry for it to calculate, or whether you wouldn't notice from your view whether it's a sharp edge or not. And now we've looked at those sort of common 3D terms and key terms. You'll be able to go on and use the modeling tutorials to actually go ahead and model a bullet that looks similar to this. And this week is only going to be modeling a bullet that looks like this. And then further on, you'll be looking at actually applying the textures and all that to it. But yeah, it looks quite simple. It looks like it's just a cylinder with a cone or a funny shaped cone type of thing on the top of a bullet. But you do actually have a recess edge in here and a few other things that you work through. And it's a good little tutorial, a good example of how to create something, and shows you all the concepts that we've kind of gone through over this past lecture. Okay, and I will see you in the labs for this. And if you've watched this and we're not in the labs but you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But yeah, I'd rather you ask me questions than sit there and not fully understand something, or have the question and wait until next time you see me. If you've got a question, even if it's just a short thing, and there is no silly questions as well, especially when you're new to this and you're all getting into the new stuff. There's probably lots of things that you're thinking, you've said this, but I didn't understand what that meant at all. So, and it's difficult for me because obviously doing this for years and years, and then, teaching these things, I'm in a world where these things are quite obvious to me, and then you kind of forget that they're not obvious to everybody. So I do try to think about that, but it's not always, something that it comes to me. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch, and thanks for watching.